Story 1. The footsteps above my bedroom. The sound that woke me, I still remember looking at the clock beside my bed and seeing 3:07 in bright red numbers. I had woken up suddenly, though I couldn't explain why. For a few seconds, I just lay there in the dark, trying to understand what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, slow footsteps moving across the hallway upstairs. The house should have been empty except for me. My father had already left for work hours earlier and nobody else lived with us. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but the sound continued. One step, then another, heavy enough to make the old floor creak. I stayed completely still beneath my blanket, listening. The footsteps crossed the hallway and eventually stopped directly above my bedroom. The silence afterward felt worse than the noise itself. Gosh, years have passed since that night, and I still sleep with the light on. What happened afterward is the reason. Life after my parents divorced. At the time, I was 16 and had been living with my dad for about 8 months after my parents divorced. The separation wasn't dramatic, but it changed everything. My mom moved to another town, and I ended up staying with my father in the house where he had grown up. It was an old 2-story place on a quiet street, built sometime in the 1950s. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms that nobody really used anymore. My dad slept in the master bedroom upstairs, while I stayed in a small bedroom downstairs near the kitchen. He said it made more sense because I stayed up later and wouldn't wake him before school. Most days followed the same routine. I would come home from school around 3, make something to eat, and wait for my dad to get back from work. He worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant and usually came home tired. We'd eat dinner together while watching television, talk about school or work, and then spend the rest of the evening doing our own things. Around 9 or 10, I'd go downstairs, play video games for an hour, and eventually head to bed. My father often left for work before sunrise, so I usually woke up to an empty house. The house itself had its own personality. The stairs creaked loudly no matter how carefully you walked on them. The wooden floors upstairs popped during cold nights. Heating system made strange knocking sounds through the walls whenever it turned on. Sometimes doors shifted slightly because the house had settled over the years. The upstairs rooms stayed mostly empty, except for old furniture and storage boxes. I rarely went up there unless I needed something. Looking back, that part of the house always felt separate somehow, but at the time it was simply normal. At least that's what I believed then. The first strange sounds. The first noises started a few weeks after I moved in, and honestly, they didn't seem important at the time. The house had always made sounds. Anyone who had lived there for more than a few days knew that. The heating pipes clicked, the stairs settled, and the upstairs floors creaked whenever the weather changed. Most nights, I would fall asleep with my television on low volume. Sometime after midnight, I would occasionally hear a floorboard creak upstairs. Sometimes it sounded like a bedroom door, moving slightly. Other times it was just a soft noise that lasted only a second before the house became quiet again. The first time I mentioned it to my father, he barely looked up from his coffee. He told me old houses made noises all the time, and that I was probably paying attention to them because the place still felt new to me. His explanation made sense, and I didn't think much about it afterward. The sounds continued. They never seemed loud enough to scare me. They were simply strange enough to notice. Some nights, there would be nothing at all. Other nights, I would hear 2 or 3 creaks from upstairs before everything became silent again. Looking back now, there was one detail I completely missed. The noises only happened after my father had already left for work. At the time, I never connected the two things. I assumed he was still upstairs getting ready or moving around before leaving. It wasn't until much later that I realized his truck had usually been gone for hours before those sounds ever started. That was probably the first sign that something wasn't right. The nightly footsteps begin after a while. The sounds upstairs started changing. Instead of random creaks or brief noises, I began hearing what sounded like actual footsteps. At first, it only happened every few nights. I would wake up sometime after 3 in the morning and hear slow movement above my bedroom. The footsteps weren't fast. They sounded deliberate, as if someone was walking carefully from one room to another. Sometimes they would cross the hallway and disappear. Other times they would stop for several seconds before continuing again. The strangest part was where they stopped. More than once I heard them directly above my bedroom. The upstairs room over mine had been empty for years, yet the footsteps would reach that spot and remain there. I would lie perfectly still in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting for them to continue. Eventually they always did. During the day, I started checking the upstairs before school. I told myself I was only curious, but looking back, I think I was already scared. Most mornings, everything looked normal. Beds remained untouched. The closets were empty, and the rooms smelled like dust and old wood. But every now and then I noticed small things. One bedroom door that I remembered closing would be partly open. A chair in the hallway seemed slightly out of place. An old storage box appeared to have been moved a few inches. None of it was serious enough to prove anything, yet it bothered me. One afternoon, I found a window in the back bedroom unlocked. I was certain it had been closed because my father always checked the windows before winter. When I mentioned these things to him, he became frustrated. He said I was spending too much time alone in the house and allowing my imagination to take over. According to him, old houses shifted, doors moved, and people often remembered things incorrectly. Part of me believed him, but the footsteps kept returning. I began sleeping with my television on all night because the noise helped cover the sounds upstairs. Some mornings, I barely slept at all. I would stay awake listening, waiting for the footsteps to begin, knowing they probably would. And eventually they always did. The bedroom door incident. The night that changed everything happened sometime in early November. I remember it was cold enough that the heating system had been running almost constantly, and I had gone to bed earlier than usual because I had a test at school the next morning. I woke up sometime after 3 to the familiar sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, nothing seemed different. The same slow pace moved across the hallway above me. I remember pulling the blanket closer and waiting for the sounds to stop like they always did. But this time, they didn't. I heard the stairs creak. There was no mistaking it. Someone was coming downstairs. Every step sounded slow and careful. The footsteps crossed the living room floor and eventually stopped outside my bedroom door. I could hear my own breathing and the sound of the heater running somewhere inside the walls. Then the doorknob moved. It was silent. It turned slightly, almost as if someone was checking whether the door was locked. I finally whispered, "Dad." There was no answer. A few seconds later, I called louder, expecting to hear his voice from the hallway. Nothing. The person outside my room remained completely silent. After what felt like several minutes, I heard the footsteps move away, cross the living room, and slowly climb the stairs again. I never went back to sleep. I sat against my headboard until sunlight came through the windows, waiting for my father to come home. The police discovery when my father came home that afternoon, I finally told him everything. For the first time, he took me seriously. We searched the entire upstairs together, including a small attic space above the back bedroom that neither of us had checked before. Inside, we found old blankets, empty food wrappers, and several water bottles that didn't belong to us. The attic window had a damaged latch, and there was evidence that someone had been using the space temporarily. My father called the police immediately. They searched the house and believed someone may have entered through the attic access point and stayed there without our knowledge. No fingerprints or useful evidence were found. No suspect was ever identified. To this day, I still don't know who was walking above my bedroom. Story 2. Someone walked outside my bedroom every night for almost 2 weeks. Someone walked past my bedroom door every night at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. At least that's what it sounded like. The footsteps always came from the far end of my apartment hallway. It would move slowly across the floor, stop for a few seconds outside my bedroom, and then continue toward the kitchen before everything became quiet again. The problem was that I lived alone. The first night it happened, I convinced myself it was one of my neighbors. The walls in the building were thin, and sounds often traveled in strange ways. But the footsteps kept returning, and they always sounded as if they were inside my apartment rather than somewhere outside it. Every night I would wake up and wait for them. Sometimes I checked the clock before they started. It was almost always close to 3. Looking back, the routine itself was what frightened me most. Whatever I was hearing seemed to arrive at the exact same time, and I still don't know who was walking outside my bedroom door. Moving into the apartment. I had moved into the apartment about 4 months earlier, shortly after graduating from college. It was my first time living completely on my own, and honestly, I loved it. After years of sharing dorm rooms and having roommates, having my own space felt like a huge step forward. The apartment itself wasn't particularly special. It was on the second floor of a small building with only 8 units. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older couples and a few working professionals. During the day, the parking lot stayed nearly empty, and at night, the entire building became surprisingly silent. I had just started a new job at a medical office across town. My days followed the same routine. I left around 7 in the morning, worked until late afternoon, stopped at the grocery store when I needed to, and came home before dark. Most evenings were simple. I would cook dinner, watch television on the couch, and usually call my mother before going to bed. She worried about me living alone, so we spoke almost every night. Sometimes we talked for 5 minutes, and other times we stayed on the phone for nearly an hour. Afterward, I would clean the kitchen, lock the front door, and prepare for the next day. I usually left a small lamp on in the living room because I didn't like walking through a completely dark apartment. My bedroom sat at the end of a narrow hallway that connected the bathroom, a storage closet, and the kitchen. It never felt uncomfortable. In fact, the apartment always felt safe. The neighbors were quiet. Occasionally I heard someone closing a door or using the stairs outside, but nothing unusual. The woman below me was elderly and spent most of her time visiting family. The man across the hall worked nights and was rarely home. For the first few months, I genuinely enjoyed living alone. It felt peaceful, predictable, and comfortable. That's why the footsteps bothered me so much. They didn't belong there. The first hallway sounds, the first time I heard the footsteps, I didn't even sit up. It was sometime during the middle of the night, and I was still half asleep when the sound woke me. At first I assumed someone in the building had come home late. The walls and floors weren't particularly thick, and I had heard neighbors moving around before. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. A few seconds later I heard the sound again. It wasn't loud. It was simply closer than I expected. The footsteps seemed to move slowly along the hallway outside my bedroom, almost as if someone was walking from the living room toward the kitchen. The building had old pipes that occasionally made knocking sounds, so I told myself that was probably what I was hearing. Apartments settle, heaters make noise, and sounds often travel through walls in strange ways. That explanation worked for a while, but the footsteps didn't continue past my room. They stopped directly outside my bedroom door. I remember opening my eyes and staring into the darkness, listening carefully. The apartment had become completely silent. I expected to hear another step, a door closing, or the sound of someone outside in the hallway, but nothing happened. After a minute or two, the sound finally continued toward the kitchen before disappearing altogether. The next morning I walked through the apartment before leaving for work. Everything looked normal. The front door was locked, the windows were closed, and nothing appeared disturbed. Still, something about those footsteps stayed with me. They had sounded too close. And for the first time since moving into the apartment, I felt uncomfortable going to bed. Escalation after that first night, the footsteps started happening more often. At first it was every few days, then every other night, and eventually they became part of my routine. Almost every morning I would wake up sometime around 3 and listen to someone walking through my apartment hallway. The sounds never changed. They began near the living room, moved slowly toward my bedroom, stopped outside my door, and then continued toward the kitchen. Sometimes the entire thing lasted less than a minute, but those 60 seconds felt much longer when I was lying awake in the dark. I stopped telling myself it was the neighbors. One morning I walked into the kitchen and found one of the upper cabinets hanging open. I knew I had closed it before going to bed because I always checked the kitchen at night. It seemed like a small thing, so I ignored it. A few days later I found the front door unlocked. The deadbolt was still engaged, but the lower lock had been turned. I convinced myself that I had forgotten to lock it properly, even though I had followed the same routine every night for months. Then small items started appearing in strange places. My television remote was on the kitchen counter. A book from my bedroom was sitting on the couch. A glass that I left in the sink appeared on the dining table. None of these things felt important by themselves. Together they slowly began to wear me down. I started sleeping with the hallway light on. A few nights later I left the kitchen light on as well. The apartment no longer felt comfortable. Every room seemed different after midnight. At work, people noticed I looked tired. One of my coworkers asked if I was staying out late, and another told me I looked exhausted. I wasn't sleeping properly anymore. Even on quiet nights, I stayed awake waiting for the footsteps. Eventually, I bought a small battery-powered door alarm from a hardware store. It attached to the front door and would make a loud sound if the door opened. For several nights, nothing happened. Then one night, just after 3 in the morning, the alarm suddenly activated. The sound filled the apartment. I jumped out of bed, turned on every light, and checked every room. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. Nobody was inside. And somehow, that frightened me more than finding someone there. Security footage. After the alarm incident, I finally spoke to the apartment manager. I felt embarrassed explaining everything because, by that point, I wasn't even sure how it sounded to other people. I told him about the footsteps, the alarm, and the feeling that someone was walking through my apartment at night. He listened patiently and offered to check the security cameras that covered the main hallway outside my unit. The next afternoon, we sat in his office and watched the footage from the previous night. Around 3 o'clock, the hallway remained completely empty. No one entered my apartment floor. No doors opened. Nobody walked past my unit. We checked another night, then another. Each recording showed the same thing. Nothing. For a few days, I actually felt relieved. If nobody was there, then maybe the sounds had some reasonable explanation. Maybe I was hearing pipes, neighbors, or noises from another apartment. The footsteps continued. Every night they moved down my hallway and stopped outside my bedroom exactly as before. I started questioning myself. I wondered whether I had been waking up between dreams or imagining parts of the sounds after hearing something else. I began writing down the times in a notebook beside my bed because I no longer trusted my own memory. The most frightening part wasn't the possibility that someone was inside my apartment. It was the possibility that nobody was there at all. The maintenance crawl space a few weeks later. A maintenance worker discovered an unsecured crawl space above several apartments while repairing water damage. The area connected multiple units through narrow access panels that most residents didn't even know existed. Inside, workers found old blankets, empty food containers, and signs that someone had been staying there temporarily. Some of the vacant apartments had also been entered. Nobody could prove whether the person had ever entered my apartment, but the discovery explained enough for me. I ended my lease shortly afterward and moved closer to my parents. Even now, I still wake up around 3 in the morning and listen. Story 3. The footsteps came from my parents' hallway, immediate hook. I was home from college for winter break when I heard the footsteps for the first time. It was a little after 3 in the morning. I had been awake for only a few seconds when I noticed someone walking slowly through the hallway outside my bedroom. At first I assumed it was my father. My parents had always been early risers, and my dad often woke up during the night to get water or check the thermostat. The footsteps sounded normal enough. They moved down the hallway at a steady pace and stopped somewhere near my door. I stayed in bed, waiting for him to continue. Then I heard my father's voice. He spoke quietly from his bedroom, which was directly across the hall from mine. "Did you hear that?" For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The footsteps were still there. Both of us listened as someone walked slowly through the hallway between our rooms. My father was inside his bedroom. I was inside mine. And neither of us knew who was standing outside our doors, turning home. I had been away at college for almost 4 months when I came home for winter break. The semester had been stressful, and by the time finals ended, all I wanted was to sleep in my old room and spend a few weeks doing absolutely nothing. My parents had lived in the same house for nearly 20 years. It was the house where my sister and I grew up, where birthdays were celebrated, and where every holiday eventually brought everyone back together. Even after moving away, the place still felt exactly the same whenever I returned. The neighborhood was quiet, filled mostly with families who had lived there for years. Nothing about the area ever seemed dangerous. People walked their dogs at night, children rode bicycles during the summer, and neighbors often stopped to talk in their driveways. My old bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway, directly across from my parents' room. The furniture hadn't changed much since high school. My desk was still there, along with old books, posters, and boxes filled with things I had never taken to college. Most evenings followed a comfortable routine. My mother cooked dinner while my father watched the news in the living room. We would eat together, talk about school, work, and family, and then spend the rest of the evening watching movies or old television shows. Those weeks felt relaxing in a way that college never did. I slept later than usual, spent time with my parents, and enjoyed being back in a familiar place. There was something comforting about hearing the dishwasher running downstairs, or my father making coffee early in the morning. The house itself had always been quiet, It occasionally made normal sounds during the night, but nothing unusual. My parents had lived there for 2 decades without any serious problems. No break-ins, no strange neighbors, and no stories about anything unusual happening inside the house. Because of that, when the footsteps first started, nobody immediately assumed something was wrong. It was our home. It's the last place any of us expected to feel afraid. The first night it happened was several days before the experience my father and I shared. At the time, I didn't think it was important enough to remember. I had gone to bed fairly late after watching a movie downstairs with my parents. Sometime during the night, I woke up briefly and heard someone walking in the hallway outside my room. The footsteps were slow, but completely ordinary. Because the house had always felt safe, I assumed one of my parents had gotten up. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, while we were eating breakfast, my mother asked me if I had been walking around during the night.
Ow.
She said she had heard footsteps near the bedrooms sometime after midnight. I told her no. My father looked up from his newspaper and asked who she thought it was. She assumed it had been me, because my bedroom sat at the end of the hallway. When I explained that I had been asleep, she seemed confused for a moment, but quickly dismissed it. My father said he hadn't gotten out of bed either. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Nobody appeared concerned. Old houses make sounds. People wake up during the night, and memories are often unreliable first thing in the morning. Looking back, that was probably the moment we should have paid more attention. Instead, we all accepted the simplest explanation. Someone must have heard something incorrectly. At the time, that answer felt completely reasonable. Multiple nights after that first conversation at breakfast, the footsteps continued to appear every few nights. They never happened at the same exact time, but they almost always occurred sometime after everyone had gone to bed. At first, nobody connected the experiences because each of us assumed someone else in the house was awake. My mother heard movement outside her bedroom one night and thought my father had gone downstairs. My father later mentioned hearing someone walking toward the bathroom and assumed it was me. I heard footsteps outside my room twice and believed one of my parents had gotten up during the night. The sounds themselves were never loud. They were slow, measured footsteps moving through the upstairs hallway. Sometimes they seemed to travel from my parents' bedroom toward mine. Other times they stopped outside one of the doors for several seconds before continuing. The pauses bothered me more than the movement itself. At dinner one evening, my mother asked whether anyone else had been hearing someone walking around upstairs. The conversation became strangely quiet. For the first time, all 3 of us realized we had experienced similar things. My father still believed there was a simple explanation. He blamed the house settling or the heating system moving through the walls. My mother wasn't convinced, but she didn't seem frightened either. I tried to agree with both of them because I didn't want to appear nervous. Still, something in the house had changed. The hallway suddenly felt different after dark. Small sounds that once seemed normal became impossible to ignore. Doors remained closed more often. The upstairs lights stayed on later into the evening. Eventually, I started staying awake intentionally. I would lie in bed with my phone beside me, listening to the house become quiet. I knew roughly when the sounds usually happened, and I wanted to prove to myself that they had a reasonable explanation. Most nights, nothing happened. But on the nights when the footsteps returned, I would remain completely still, listening as someone moved slowly through the hallway outside my room. The worst part was that nobody seemed frightened enough to act, yet nobody could explain what we were hearing either. Little by little, the atmosphere inside the house became tense. Even during the day, the silence felt different. The night everyone heard it. The night that everyone heard the footsteps happened about a week before I returned to college. I woke up sometime after 3 in the morning to the sound of someone walking slowly through the hallway outside my bedroom. This time the footsteps were louder. They moved from one end of the hallway to the other, paused outside my parents' room, and then continued toward mine. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. Before I could say anything, I heard my mother speak from across the hall. "Did you hear that?" My father answered immediately. The footsteps continued. For several seconds, all 3 of us remained silent while the sound moved between our bedrooms. My father eventually opened his door and turned on the hallway light. The footsteps stopped completely. He checked every room upstairs. Nothing. He went downstairs and searched the kitchen, living room, garage, and basement. My mother and I waited in the hallway while he looked through the house. After several minutes, he returned and told us he hadn't found anyone. The only unusual thing was the back door. It was slightly open. Not wide enough to immediately attract attention, but enough to allow cold air inside. None of us could remember leaving it that way. My father thought he might have forgotten to close it earlier in the evening, while my mother insisted she had checked it before bed. Nobody knew for certain. That uncertainty stayed with us. Because if the door had been left open accidentally, then the footsteps had no explanation. And if someone had opened it during the night, we never discovered who it was. Leaving again a few days later, I packed my car and returned to college. The drive back felt normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night in the hallway. Before leaving, I asked my parents if they had heard anything else. My mother said no. My father simply told me not to worry about it. Over time, they stopped mentioning the footsteps entirely. Whenever I came home for holidays or weekends, the subject never came up again. It was as if everyone had quietly agreed to leave it behind. But I couldn't. Even now, years later, I refuse to sleep in my old bedroom. When I visit my parents, I stay in the guest room downstairs. Because every time I walk through that hallway at night, I still remember those footsteps moving between our doors. The sound that shouldn't be there after hearing these stories. The thing that stays with me isn't the possibility that someone was inside those houses or apartments. It's the fact that every person involved believed the sounds belonged to someone they trusted. We hear footsteps inside our homes every day. A parent walking to the kitchen, a child going to the bathroom, a husband getting a drink of water, a pet moving through the hallway. Most of the time, we don't even think about it. The sounds feel normal because they belong to people who are supposed to be there. That's what makes these experiences so disturbing. In every story, the footsteps were given an explanation before anyone asked questions. The teenager believed it was his father upstairs. The woman living alone convinced herself it was her neighbors. The family assumed another person in the house had gotten out of bed. Looking back, all of them ignored the same warning. Something was moving through their homes, and nobody stopped to ask who it was. Certain images seemed to appear in every story. A hallway at 3 a.m, a closed bedroom door, slow footsteps moving across wooden floors, silence afterward, someone lying awake in the dark, listening carefully and hoping the sound belongs to someone familiar. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Many of us have experienced strange sounds during the night and immediately found a reason to explain them away. Oh, maybe it was the heater, maybe it was the house settling, maybe someone else was awake. Those explanations usually make sense, which is exactly why we accept them. But sometimes the explanation arrives too quickly. Sometimes a door remains unlocked. Sometimes footsteps stop outside a bedroom. Sometimes nobody admits they were awake. Years later, people often remember the same thing. It's not the fear itself, but the moment they realized they had ignored the first warning. The strange sound, the open door, the movement in the hallway, because the frightening part wasn't hearing footsteps at 3 a.m. It was realizing that none of us ever stopped to ask who they belonged to.